All right, let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us for day one of the Ohio US EPA Brownfields Grant Writing Workshop. My name is Roxanne Anderson, and I am the Region 5 Director for the Kansas State University Technical Assistance to Brownfields, or KSU TAB program. We're really excited to have you here. We know the Brownfields grant process can be a little overwhelming sometimes, so our goal over the next 2 days is to break down the process, share some real-world experiences, some lessons learned, and hopefully you can feel a little more confident as you move towards your next application. We also have some fantastic speakers and panelists joining us, and we have intentionally built in time for questions, discussion, hand-on application of what you're learning today. Before we jump in, I'm going to jump into a few housekeeping items. Awesome. Um, First, a couple of technical notes. If you experience any technical difficulties during this workshop, please use the phone number or email address shown here on the screen. Someone from our team will be available to help you or troubleshoot, and you can also put some things in the chat if you need to. We are also recording today's workshop. The recording and workshop materials will be available through KSU Tab website and the workshop page. A lot of the resources and materials are currently already on the web page if you need to access those. We'll place those links in the chat. I believe Hannah, our excellent helper, has already done that today. So you don't have to frantically write everything down you see today. Just kind of absorb it in and you can check that all out later. Speaking of the chat, I realized that at this point, most of us have probably spent more time on Zoom than we wanted to, but just a few reminders. Make sure your microphone remains muted and your camera's turned off. It should automatically have already done that, but just in case, please make sure that it stays that way. It helps us limit distractions and keep everything running smoothly. If you need to ask a question, you can do so in the chat. We also ask that to make sure that your Zoom name matches the name you use when you register. This is important because it just helps us verify attendance and keep track of everything. And so we can contact you if we need to. If you need to change it, you can click on the participants button, find your name, select more, and then just choose rename. And finally, and most importantly, we absolutely encourage questions throughout the workshop. As I mentioned, please use the chat feature to submit those questions as they come up. We would prefer that questions be sent to everyone so that others can benefit from the conversation as well, but you can also send a question directly to a speaker if you're more comfortable doing that. We want this to be interactive, so please don't be shy. And there's a very good chance that if you have a question, someone else is also wondering the same thing. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to pass this off to our generous hosts, Ohio EPA and Corin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for our webinar today. So I am Corin Fogel. I am the supervisor of the Brownfield program here at Ohio EPA. We have several of our staff with us as well. We have Dan Joker, who is the lead Brownfield worker. We have Shelby Powell, who will be presenting as a panelist. And we have Richard Murray, who will be presenting as well. Those are Brownfield coordinators. So the program we have here, hopefully you are familiar with it. If not, Richard will go into more detail about our program and the services that we offer. But we have a targeted brownfield assessment program where we can provide assistance to public entities for assessment activities. So things like phase 1, phase 2, asbestos, lead-based paint surveys, things like that. And we also here at Ohio EPA, which maybe you are familiar with it, we have a voluntary action program, which is a voluntary cleanup program. So our brownfield program is kind of a first step, kind of getting a assessment done for a property, and then other funds can be used to clean up the site. And then you may enter the voluntary action program to get a release of liability for the contamination at a property. So we can go into the agenda now. So this is going to be 2 days, the morning of today and tomorrow morning as well. So after I am done speaking, we're going to hear from John Jervis, who is the EPA Region 5 Brownfields Coordinator and Project Manager. So he manages our grants that Ohio EPA has, as well as others in Region 5. So his presentation will be very valuable to kind of do an overview of the MARC grants, multi-purpose community-wide assessment, coalition assessment, and cleanup grants. And then after John, we will have a panel presentation, which is a walkthrough of the grants, what to do, what not to do when preparing a grant application. So this will be going over sections 1 and 2 of the grant narrative. So with that, we will have several panelists and we will have presenters. So Amy Ursovich, who's a KSU tab partner, and Roxanne Anderson will be doing the main presentation, but we will have panelists kind of offering their opinions and interjections along the way, as well as some questions that we have for them. So those will include Hallie Miller, who is the Associate Director at Partners Environmental, and Shelby Powell, who I mentioned earlier, is part of our team here at Ohio EPA, and she is a brownfield coordinator. And then we also have Kim Staggerwald, who is the Director of Acquisition and Disposition at the Cuyahoga County Land Bank. And then we will be taking a break. So that would maybe be, maybe around 11 or so. And then we're going to have a group exercise after that, after the break, which will be an overview of the first part of the grant application. And we're going to have breakout sessions. So there will be several leaders of the breakout groups, and we will be going over some tips as well. And then we will come back together and do a report out and share what you have learned in your group exercise. So as I mentioned earlier, we have 3 wonderful panelists today. We have Hallie Miller, who is from Partners. She's the Associate Director. We have Shelby Powell, who was in consulting and is now a project coordinator with us from Ohio EPA. And we have Kim Staggerwald, who is with the Cuyahoga County Land Bank. And so, yes, feel free to direct questions towards them. They will be participating in our discussion here in a little bit.
Thank you so much, Corin. Before I pass this off to John, I just wanted to touch base for those of you who are not familiar with KSU TAB. And the program, it is federally funded and it covers, the program is provided by funding from the EPA, and there is a KSU tab, or I'm sorry, there is a tab in every EPA region across the country, and KSU covers Region 5. And then it also covers Region 6, 7, and 8. KSU offers lots of services to communities and nonprofits that help with brownfield redevelopment, anything from grant writing and webinars, which we're doing today, to planning, environmental aspects, work plans, services, community outreach, things like that. It's a large list of things that are very specific to every community that we engage with. So if you think that you need help with your brownfield, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, because we can kind of walk you through that process and connect you to who you need to be talking to if it's not us. And so with that, I am going to pass this off to John Jervis. Oh, I forgot. I also wanted to mention that we, as an educational background, we like to make sure to get as much information as possible about the webinars and the workshops that we provide, so that as we continue to do that, we can improve upon them. So this is the link for the feedback. You do not have to do it now. You can do it at the end of both days, but we do want to make sure to remind you that we would very much like your feedback. And there's a QR link or a link that you can click that we'll put in the chat for you to provide that for us. Okay, now I'm going to pass it off to John.
All right. Thank you, Roxanne, and thank you, Corin, for that great intro. So my name is John Jervis. I work for the EPA in Region 5 in the Brownfields program, and today I'm going to give an overview of EPA Brownfields Grants and the upcoming competition. Next slide, please. Just as a note, and it was already in the chat, the slides are shared and online. So if anything, if I go through anything too fast, or if there's links that you want to click on, you will have access to them. So today I will be going through the upcoming competition grant offerings. So the grants that are going to be available in the fall, and then an overview of each of the grant types, and then some resources from EPA for getting your applications together, and also some tips for writing your application. Next slide, please. So just a quick introduction to the EPA Brownfields program. So EPA Brownfields was established as a grant and assistance program to help communities and nonprofits that have contaminated sites get them back into productive use. So there's a couple links on this page that you can learn more general information about the history of the program and also our offerings. Next slide, please. So we're going to start off with the recently released grant offerings for the upcoming competition cycle, and there's some things that I want to point out on here. And then on the next slide, I'll get a little bit into what the anticipated schedule is. So the first thing I want to point out is just what grants are being offered. So similar to the last couple of years, we have 3 different types of assessment grants. That's our community-wide assessment, assessment coalitions, and then assessment grants for state and tribes. And then we're going to have cleanup grants as we do every year. And you'll notice that multi-purpose is not on here, but revolving loan funds are on here this year. Those typically switch off every other year. So this is a year where revolving loan fund grants are offered. Another thing to note, so we are moving past having the additional infrastructure law funding. So the amount of awards and the maximum amount per grant has decreased pretty much across the board this year. We still expect to get a lot of awards out in Region 5. We always end up being towards the top in terms of the amount of grants that we get. And then the cost share, the statutory cost share is back for the cleanup and revolving loan fund grants for a 20% of the entire grant amount. Next slide, please. So the anticipated competition timeline. So none of these dates, nothing on here is final yet. This is just how it typically works in other years. Obviously, things can come up. There was a government shutdown last year that kind of delayed things a little bit, but generally, the guidelines get posted in the fall. This is either in August or September. They are available and open for 60 days to submit your application. Throughout the winter is when all the applications get reviewed for the threshold, making sure that the grants meet threshold, and then also the narrative review. And then announcements typically happen in the spring, sometime typically in late April or sometime in May. And then in the summer, which is what we're going through now, is when the new grantees are putting together their work plans and resubmitting their application forms. And then the funding will hit everybody's account October 1st is when the grant period starts. So basically, it's a full year cycle to get the funding and get everything ready to go. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to kind of go into each of the grant types. This is just a pretty broad overview. There's obviously a lot of information about each of these grants. And as I'll mention a couple times, the best place to find information about them is going to be the guidelines. And one thing I want to note is that as I talk through these grant types, keep in mind that there can be small changes when the notice of funding is released in the fall. This is information from the previous round of funding. Typically, things stay pretty similar, so I feel comfortable talking about this information, but just note that there could be small changes. So the first type of grants are assessment grants. And as I mentioned, there's 3 different types. There's community-wide assessment grants, assessment coalitions, and then our community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes. So these are very versatile grants. They're great for getting out there and figuring out what issues you have, if any, at your sites, what barriers you have to redevelopment. Everybody knows they can be used for normal environmental site assessments. So phase 1, phase 2, asbestos and lead surveys, supplemental assessments, but they can also be used for things like inventorying. So getting a better handle on your entire universe of brownfields, site-specific cleanup planning. This is a great one. You can use assessment grants to put together ABCAs, which is analysis of brownfield cleanup alternative, something that's required for our cleanup grants, and also things like remedial action plans. And also do some area-wide planning on brownfield sites, and then community involvement, which is a big aspect of all of our grants here in the Brownfields program. And then starting with community-wide assessment grants, that was kind of an overview for all of them, but for community-wide assessment grants, these are the grants for a single community or nonprofit that comes in and wants to do assessment work within their jurisdiction. The funding's up to $500,000 and the project period is 4 years. So typically, or for these, applicants will identify target areas and then priority sites within their target areas, and then kind of their application will be writing a story about how they're going to get those sites to redevelopment. Next slide, please. So the next type of assessment grant is our assessment coalition grants. These have a few more requirements when applying that I'm going to get into, and that's because there's more entities that are involved. So these are designed to have one lead entity, and they're the ones who get awarded the grant, and they have control over the funds. But they will have 2 to 4 partner entities. So the eligibility is the same for the lead and the non-leads. And there must be 2, but not more than 4 eligible entities. And when you're looking for these entities that are going to be partners, it must include a member that has never been awarded a brownfields grant. If they have an open assessment or multi-purpose, it must be drawn down 70%. That threshold can change. It has changed in the past, but 70% was last year. And then there can't be multiple agencies from the same entity. So if you want your lead entity to be a county, for example, the redevelopment authority of the same county can't be a coalition member. Next slide, please. And then just a little bit more. So coalition grants were designed to get more communities into the program. So we know that not every community is ready to handle and run their own assessment grants. So this allows communities without that capacity or without that ability to be able to still get funding for assessments in their area. And how they work is each of the coalition members, as well as the lead, designates a target area, and then they are required to assess a minimum of 2 sites in each of the members and also of the lead's geographic boundaries. So the funding is doubled from what the community-wide is, so it's up to $1 million, and it is for up to 4 years. Next slide, please. And then the final assessment grant type is the community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes. And I know most of the audience today isn't states and tribes, but it's still important to know about these kind of grants and what they give our states the ability to do. So who can apply? Essentially, it is in the title, is just states and tribes. But what they do is they allow the states and tribes to perform assessments throughout their whole geographic jurisdiction. So for example, what this has meant for Ohio EPA, who has one of these grants, is that they've been able to expand their targeted brownfield assessment program that Corin talked about at the beginning, and perform more assessments throughout the state. So this is just another, these grants got introduced during the last 5 years, and they've been a great way to additionally get additional funding to different communities that aren't applying for their own grants. Next slide, please. Cleanup grants. So cleanup grants they provide funding to perform site remediation at individual sites. Important to note that the assessment of these sites needs to be done during the lead up to applying. So cleanup grant funding cannot be used for assessment funding or for assessments. So it's good to have additional capacity to perform assessments, whether it be through a EPA Brownfields grant or working with Ohio EPA or other potential local options. When applying for cleanup grants, you must own the site. As I mentioned earlier, there is a 20% cost share. And as also I mentioned earlier, the over the last couple of years, we were able to offer additional funding through the infrastructure law, but now we have to go back to the statutory maximum of $500,000 for these cleanup grants. And what this means is that it's now more important than ever to be creative in capital stacking in terms of getting these cleanup projects off the ground, or picking like more bite-sized projects that can be cleaned up with this amount of funding. And the project period is up to 400 or up to 4 years for these. Next slide, please. So this is the last grant that we are offering this year. And as I mentioned, this is taking the place of multipurpose for the year. So revolving loan fund grants, this is by far our most complex program and grant type. So if you are interested in this grant type, I highly recommend using the link at the bottom of this slide to learn just a lot more about the program and what it takes to kind of set up and run an RLF program as a grantee. So what they do is RLF grants capitalize a revolving loan fund to provide loans and subgrants for environmental cleanups. So the revolving happens as loans get paid back. That money can then be used to provide additional loans or provide subgrants. So these can be applied for as individually or as a coalition, but that does not change the funding amount like it does for assessment grants. There is a 20% cost share for these, just like the cleanup grants. The funding is up to $1 million. However, these RLF grants are unique in terms of the funding because successful RLF grantees who are able to loan out the money become eligible for supplemental funding that typically comes up every year. And it's a different amount every year, but basically high-performing RLF grantees get to show us that they are using the money and getting it out there in terms of loans. And then we're able to give non-competitive money to these grantees to increase which essentially increases the longevity of their RLF program. And then again, that link at the bottom has tons of information. And then if you're interested in this grant type, reach out to me as well, and I can get you connected with somebody from our RLF team to talk more about them. Next slide, please. So although not being offered this year, multi-purpose grants will be offered again for the FY28 competition. So that's the one that'll be in fall 2027, it will open. So I like to think of these as a combo of an assessment and a cleanup grant. So on our normal assessment grants, you can't use the money for cleanups, and on our normal cleanup grants, you can't use the money for assessments. This kind of bridges that, and it gives you the ability to assess and clean up sites using the same grant. I didn't have the info on there. They're up to 5 years, and they are up to, I believe, $1 million, but that's subject to change because they won't be offered this year. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip this slide just because I talk about this link again later on. So next slide, please. Okay, so tips for writing the narrative. So I've put this together, I think, over the last couple of years in talking with some of my colleagues. I've been reviewing applications for 8 or 9 years now, and these are things that just constantly come up, and a lot of them seem like no-brainers, but it's just the competition, as everybody knows, is very tight every year, and it is good to just be reminded of some of these things. So first and foremost, read the entire guidelines for the grant type which you're applying. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. There are a lot of nuances for each of the different grant types. They have different requirements. They have different attachments that you have to put in. So making sure that you are comfortable with the entire guidelines. Write as though the reader knows nothing about your community, because this is the case. So the grants get reviewed by 2 to 3 reviewers, and chances are that none of them have stepped foot in your community. So write it as if, this is the first time that somebody is being introduced to your area. So avoid using acronyms and technical organizational jargon. This is just, it makes it easier for reviewers. We're not typically Googling all these different acronyms and stuff. So it's important to kind of leave that and assume you don't know the background of the reviewers. Respond to criteria on where asked. So every year we'll get applications that have They might have the answer to a criteria, but it's in the wrong section. It's hard to find. It's obscure. Make sure that you're putting the answers in the correct section, just so you can guarantee the reviewers find them, and it just makes it easier to review your application. Number pages and enumerate and identify the criterion. This is still, you just want your application to be extremely easy to review. You want it, if a reviewer is looking for a specific criterion, you want it to be marked. And then here in bold, address all criteria. So every year we get great applications that are completely missing a section. Maybe they missed the last section, or they're missing some of the criteria might have multiple questions kind of embedded within the same criteria, and people don't address that. And those things are going to get seen. These are getting reviewed by multiple reviewers who have experience in the Brownfields program, most of which have done this before. So they will find if you're not adding or addressing all of the criteria. So quality of response is extremely important. Organizing attachments, this is also just for making it easier for your application to review. So just titling what your attachments are. Each of the grant types has different attachments required. So what's listed here is just kind of an example. Use the application checklist. So in each of the guidelines that will get released, there is an application checklist that has everything that needs to be submitted to grants.gov when you go through and do your submittal. So highly recommend using this. There's a lot of things that can be forgotten. And if you forget things, there's the potential that your proposal doesn't get reviewed or you completely miss a section or something. So definitely go through the application checklist. It's very useful. And then readability is important. These are getting reviewed. Probably the people who are reviewing them are probably going to see it just like how you're putting it together. So just looking at a computer screen, looking Microsoft Word or PDF, whatever you're working with, make sure that it's readable. Don't assume that the reviewers are going to be able to just zoom in to your tiny font. Next slide, please. All right, so put together a little list of EPA application writing resources. I want to say first, I didn't add tab on this slide. Everybody knows that tab is probably, if not the best application writing resource. They have, well, I'll leave it to Roxanne, who already kind of mentioned some of the capabilities, but these are just EPA specific resources. So the first link on here, that is the link that I probably use the most when it comes to competition. It has, it's where the new guidelines will be posted, but it also has the previous guidelines. It'll have information about any type of outreach webinars. It will have information about eligibility, about submitting multiple applications. It'll have, so like I said, it'll have the old guidelines, and until the new ones get posted, those are probably the best thing to look at to get a feel for the requirements and the criteria. So if you were to go to that link right now, you'd be able to find the FY26 guidelines. And then next link is the frequently asked questions. So this document, it has tons and tons of questions, all things EPA Brownfields Grants, from working on your application to what types of activities are eligible to we get a lot of very specific questions about different eligibilities, and people ask or I guess I'll just leave it at that. So we get a lot of just very unique questions, and they get added to the frequently asked questions every year. So if you have a situation, you have a question about eligibility or different activities that you want to do under your grant, I highly recommend going to the FAQ. And then Brownfields Programs Fact Sheet. So we've developed a fair amount of fact sheets about different activities that you can perform under the different types of grants, whether that be health monitoring, area-wide planning. So if you're interested in putting any of those into your grants or into your grant applications, these fact sheets are great to help you kind of scope what that work can look like. And there is one more link that I did not put in here, but I will put in the chat after I'm done presenting. So this year, EPA has posted all of the applications from the last grant cycle online, and it marks whether or not they are successful or unsuccessful. But they will probably only be up there until the new competition opens in the fall. So highly recommend going in and downloading some of the successful ones. I can say with how close the competition is every year, any successful application, you can guarantee it's an exceptional application. So I don't have necessarily recommendations for which ones to download, but I can tell you that if it won the competition, it scored extremely high and it is exceptional. Next slide, please. And then finally, some reminders for submitting your application package. This kind of just adds to the tips from the other page. These are things that we see every year. So submitting your application package early. Every year there's issues with people with last second submittals, whether they're having issues with grants.gov or they realize that they don't have active sam.gov and grants.gov accounts. So that kind of leads into the second bullet, which is making sure you have active accounts on both sam.gov and grants.gov. And that you can go check now, even without the guidelines out. So that's just important. Every year there ends up being some issues with that. So just trying to front run that and stop that from being an issue. Next bullet is kind of another plug for the application submission checklist. So these applications, there's a lot that goes into them. There's the narrative section, but there's also the threshold responses. There is a letter from the state. There is different attachments for different grant types. So just making sure that you go through and really make sure that you submit every required item. And then the final bullet on this slide is the grants.gov help desk. So if you are having trouble submitting, that is not something that we can really help you with in the Brownfields program because we're not kind of managers of grants.gov. So that will be something you'll reach out directly to the grants.gov help desk. Next slide, please. And then finally, before questions, so my contact information is on here. Feel free to reach out with any questions about the competition. If it's something that one of my colleagues is better suited for, I can always connect you with them. And then that link under my email address is our regional Brownfields Region 5 homepage. And on the right side of that page under contacts, there's a place to sign up for our email listserv. We send out about one email a month, and we try to put just different resources for the Brownfields program. We put when TAB has different events that are relevant to our communities, we put them on there as well. And then when the competition gets closer, we usually send out a couple more emails with just information about where to find the guidelines. Okay, that is it. I think I will probably just answer some questions in the chat as Roxanne moves this along.
Yeah, we do have time for a few questions. If anyone has any and wants to put them in the chat, we can address them now. But otherwise, as John said, he can answer them as we move forward in the chat as well. All right, so with that, I think we're going to move on to the panel presentation, which is a walkthrough of sections 1 and 2 of the grant narrative. Amy Yursevich, who has been a KSU TAB partner for quite a while, is going to start us off.
Thank you, Roxanne. Hello, everybody. As Roxanne mentioned, I am a TAB partner and been doing this for quite some time. Prior to this, I was at the Ohio EPA, so I did have some experience with both our state grants and helping out communities with grants as well. Anyways, we get started on this panel presentation. We do have some panel members. I know Roxanne and Corinne actually went through that, and we will be. I'm going to tell them to go ahead and feel free to, chime in if they need to. But there are also some things that they've mentioned they'd like to talk about during both of our presentations. So let's get started. First thing is, do you need an EPA grant? As John mentioned, EPA grants are very competitive. there are fewer of them, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that are being offered this year, fewer number. So it is going to be a very competitive and busy round. Um, and there are other options out there, and we will be talking about them throughout this webinar. Some of the questions you may want to ask are, what is the scope of my brownfield problem? Do you have a large problem? Do you have a number of sites in an industrial area or neighborhood corridor? Or do you just have one? Do you have a target area? Or is there just an area that you may want to focus on with just a couple sites? And what type of work is needed? Do you need to do planning and assessment, or do you need to do some cleanup? Do you need to do a brownfield inventory? So some of those are going to let you know whether maybe a state level grant, Ohio EPA has their targeted brownfield assessment program. There's also some grant programs through our Ohio Department of Development and things like that. So there are other options out there. Those are things that both the state environmental program will know about, as well as TAB can help you with this. Whoops. I don't think this is wanting to work for me. There we go. Hopefully it stays there. Does your community, some of the questions you might want to ask is, does your community have any kind of land use plans, any type of stakeholder plans for land use, planning analyses, district plans, corridor plans? Those are kind of important, or very important, I should say, when you are putting together any type of EPA grant. And with respect to brownfield impacts, do you have a target area or target areas, as I mentioned before? Corridors, industrial corridors, neighborhood corridors, those sorts of things. Are you working, or do you work with your community-based partners, your neighborhood organizations, maybe even church groups, nonprofits? Do a lack of funds affect the quality of life in these areas, if you have a target area or areas? Where would you get the funds otherwise? Does the community, does the city, does the county have the funds as you as the applicant to help you? Or is all that money needing to be used for other more critical sort of things? Does the timing of the grant work for the needs of the community? As John mentioned, it's not a grant that you can apply for and get in a month or two, such as a targeted brownfield assessment grant may be. You apply in the fall, they're reviewed through the rest of the winter and spring, and you don't get awarded, and the money doesn't come available until the following fall. So it is a rather long period. So if that timing works for you, that's great. If it doesn't and you need it faster, you may be looking at something else. And have you worked with Ohio EPA staff? Obviously, you heard from Corinne and Shelby, and you'll be hearing from Richard as we move on. And knowing those types of people and working with them to help you with this grant is really crucial. And I am going to pass this on to Hallie Miller, who has a few things to add with respect to considering a grant.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I just wanted to mention a bit about the brownfield inventory, which, as it relates to the target areas here. So we utilize these a lot to help kind of define that area and identify the sites in them. And that can go even further, during the grant process to identifying like where you're going to do a phase 1 or a phase 2. But in general, it could be an entire village footprint. It could be a corridor. Maybe it's somewhere you already know that has a lot of commercial industrial sites and you want to get some of that high level information about them to kind of be able to prioritize which sites should be kind of first up if you get this grant for a phase 1. And it can kind of help some of the target areas come to light. If you are doing, sort of a large area, maybe an entire town, it can help identify some of those areas or define them or delineate them a little bit better on where you want to focus and what kind of target sites you want to have. So working with those community partners too can be helpful because everyone has their own sort of idea of where the priority areas should be. And then this can be sort of a tangible document to help define that a bit better.
Thank you, Hallie. Yeah, that very, very good things to think about. Okay, so if you get to this point and decide, yeah, this is what I really need, I do need a US EPA Brownfield grant. This would really help out my community. Couple of things, as John mentioned, the coming year's guidelines, or as we call them, the FY 27 guidelines or notice of funding opportunity. You'll hear that as well, NOFO, are expected to be released in the fall, usually toward the end of September of this year. When current guidelines aren't available, which obviously is now, we want to encourage you to review the 2026 grant guidelines and FAQs, as John mentioned, that provide a ton of really helpful information. And there's the URL for that. And also encourage you to go to KSU tab, our webpage, and it is kind of a one-stop shop. You will be able to look at some successful grants. I know John mentioned, and I'm really happy to hear that because I hadn't heard this before, John, that we are going to have the grant applications from this last round posted, and they can see both successful and unsuccessful grants. We do have some of those posted, and we also have information on the different brownfield grants and and tips on applications, as well as Tab Easy, which Beth Grigsby from KSU tab will talk about a little bit more tomorrow. Requirements to submit an application. John touched on this. I get into a little bit more detail in this table, so you may want to use some of these links. As John mentioned, Hannah is going to, or has already put the slides on our website and has the link that she's put in the chat. So you can get into these and check these out now. With SAM and with grants.gov, earlier the better. Play around with these now. Make sure you're okay. You don't want to be in a situation, as John says, at the 9th, 12th hour that you can't submit this, because it's very rare that they will give you an out unless you have some giant power outage or some other major issue that you can submit your grant any other way than through grants.gov. Excuse me. So you have to have an active account. If you look under this first row, if your account is active, that's acceptable to check the entity status under SAM. There's your link. Do check that. Make sure everything's active. I encourage you to do that as quickly as possible if you are thinking about an EPA grant applying this fall. Obviously, it's going to be rejected if it's an inactive or expired account. Obtain a unique identifier, and that is done through sam.gov. If you have any questions about that, there are FAQs that provide information about the unique identifier so that you can make sure that you do actually have that. You don't want to have another organization or department's UEI, and that's critical. I'm just going to say, for example, because I have experience here with Ohio EPA, many of our departments at Ohio EPA have unique identifiers because so many of them, if not all, do rely on grants from US EPA. We have state level grants. So you want to make sure you have the correct one for your correct department or division. And we want to make sure that it's associated, your grants.gov account is associated with the correct UEI number. FAQs will talk about that as well. and that your authorized organization representative, that they are the only ones, and this is when you set up these accounts, you will have to give an authorized organization representative, or you may already have one. They are the only ones that can submit this via grants.gov. Just as an example, when we would apply for grants, and states do, as John mentioned, we have states and tribal grants through actually this particular grant program. We would sit down with our authorized representative, who was our fiscal manager, and just make sure all of this was up to date. We were ready to submit, and we wouldn't run into any kind of problems when the 12th hour arrived. Before your pen hits paper, you want to have a great project. Don't look at the grant guidelines and say, oh, if I do this, if I say this, it's going to look really good. You got to start out with a project. As Hallie mentioned, there's a lot of options out there when you work with the communities, and you really want to narrow down a good target area or target areas, your corridors, your neighborhood. So that EPA can help you with this, and they or they can answer questions. But once the guidelines are out, they cannot assist you. So you want to make sure that those questions are answered, but also that they're answering them with respect to the actual project you have, so they can help you better. You can contact us and we can help you in that way, KSU tab or any of the tabs that, if you're from a different region and listening today, and they can help you with, determining an appropriate target area if you have more than one, or you have several, good priority sites, you can propose those to them, and we can help you out with that. So there's a lot of things we can help you with, but you have to come up with that project. And so I am going to pass this on to Hallie again, because she has some other good input.
Yeah, so TAP can definitely help you be prepared ahead of time, and if you know the sites and need the specific, data gap filled, but do all that preparation as early as you can. So kind of, if you've already have some form of inventory, kind of updating that, using that to help identify the target areas. If you're going for a cleanup grant, make sure you fill any gap assessment stuff ahead of time as early as possible. You don't want to wait until the applications come out to kind of try and identify that. So if you're considering doing the grant application, like, now is a great time to verify that you sort of have what you need and what sites you're planning on doing. If you want to do community engagement at all ahead of time to help identify some of these areas, again, like, now would be the time to do a little bit of those efforts up front so that you can be fully ready for the grant application, because as you're going to be hearing all these presentations, it can be like a long, arduous process to write the grant. And you don't want to have to keep kind of pausing to determine what really the goals of it are and what sites you want to focus on and things like that. So getting any of that preparation done, even without having the exact application for this year in front of you, looking at the previous year applications and kind of determining some of those things that you can do ahead of time, filling those gaps, will be very helpful, that you can focus on the actual application when it does come out.
Thanks, Hallie. And that is so true. Looking, as John mentioned, FY26 or the previous year's guidelines are a good place to start, and I've mentioned that as well. And there may be some changes, but they're typically minor. It's just a good way to really get your head wrapped around, what kind of project's going to be good in your community, and tell a great story and be a good grant.
And access agreements. We sometimes see sites where they're like, this is the perfect site to redevelop, and we get so far even into getting, we're awarded the grant, and then we're like, cool, we're going to go to the site now, we're ready to work on it, and then we find out, oh, this person is a private owner and has no interest in allowing access or selling the property. So even though it might seem like it could be the perfect property, if you don't have the buy-in of the owner of the property and that kind of thing, it's important to kind of establish that early.
Great. great comment. That is so true. So here's our when we're talking about what you have to provide in your application, there's a lot of things. John mentioned some of these. What we're going to spend our time on is where you really need to, um, gather your information, come up with your project, and be very creative. This is the narrative ranking criteria. This is what's being scored by the reviewers. So this is a very, very important part of the application. A lot of the things in the application may be, if you have it, you're in, they're like threshold criteria, but this is really where they're doing the scoring, and you have to have a great grant to get a high score and get a grant. So what I'll be talking about is project area description and plans for revitalization. This is the first section. And Roxanne will follow me up with community need and community engagement. Tomorrow, Roxanne will talk about task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress. And I will talk about programmatic capability and past performance. And each section is made up of subsections, as John mentioned. Don't miss any of these. If you're missing something, you're going to lose a point, and there are embedded questions. One of the things I'll probably keep talking about, and I talk about putting together a good application toward the end tomorrow, is making sure that you look at this, and also you look at the section. It's, I believe, section 6 in the FY26 guidelines, where it has what the reviewers are basing their scores on. So you have that information, use it, make sure you're not missing anything. So John already put this up, so I won't spend a whole lot of time with it. What I did want to point out is there are fewer numbers of grants being offered in all the categories this year. So it is going to be a competitive round. Just to give you an example, kind of previous years, approximately 140, 150 assessment grants, and that would include coalitions, community-wide, and states and tribes added up together. So, quite a bit more, because you're looking here at 55. The cleanup grants last year, or the year before, they awarded approximately 51 grants. So revolving loan fund, they did not issue this past year, but the year before it was around 15. So it is going to be a competitive round. Just want to make you aware of that. Here's the point structure. So based on the type of grant that you're looking at, whether it's an assessment coalition, a community-wide assessment, or a cleanup. I didn't include state tribe here because it doesn't really affect most of the readers, but we can certainly get you that information if you are a state and listening in and want that. So here that just tells you how many points are going to be awarded for each of these different 4 sections. Here's some need to know grant information. Basically, as with a community-wide assessment, as Hallie was talking about, the ownership of the property is not required, but site access is. So if you're looking and putting together your priority projects and wanting to put them down as priority brownfields in your application, make sure that you're going to be able to have access. You don't have that private owner that is like, I'm never selling this property. So just something to be really well aware of as you go through your inventory, or you're making your inventory of brownfields. And as had been mentioned before, funds can be used for planning, developing site reuse plans, as well as site assessments and brownfield inventories. So it really is a very good grant in that it will help you with some of the early parts like inventorying if you need that, or updating your inventory and planning, as well as actually doing the field work. The assessment coalition, as John mentioned, you have one lead that's got to be a city, state, county, or tribe, regional council, general purpose unit of local government. And the non-leads haven't had a grant before. And you can have 2 to 4 of those. One of the things we used to be a requirement, but in the language of the last guidelines, you can either have an MOA or you can submit a signed letter. The non-leads can submit a signed letter addressed to the lead coalition saying they agree to be part of the coalition. Generally, I believe I would recommend an MOA because it kind of outlines what everybody's duties are in the coalition and makes things easier once you get awarded and you are operating as a coalition. For the cleanup grants, eligible entity must own the site. You don't have to own the site today, but if that's what you want to work on, come fall, make sure by the date that the grants are due, you have ownership. Your name is on the deed to that site or sites. You have to have an ASTM or equivalent phase 1, assessment of brownfield cleanup alternatives is what a draft APCA is. So you know what your likely cleanup is going to be, what makes most sense. Public notification and a state or tribal authority letter that states that the assessment work that has been done on the property is adequate enough to move forward with the cleanup. And the reason they do this is in the past, I believe EPA has run into situations where the assessment, the sampling and the other assessment work that has been done has not been enough to move forward, or they may have to do more once they receive that cleanup grant. And they don't want cleanup money being used on that. So that's the importance of that letter. I am going to have Shelby talk because there's also a state support letter that everybody has to have, regardless of the grant. This other one, the cleanup one, is just a little more detailed because it gets into assessment. So I'm going to pass this on to Shelby.
Thanks, Amy. Yes, I did want to, again, just add on to Amy's point that no matter what grant you are applying for, you need to reach out to us at Ohio EPA. Again, no matter what the project, if it's a petroleum site, also reach out to Buster, that other environmental authority. They would have, the authority to issue the eligibility for their program. So I just want to include those 2 notes right off the bat because this last round, I think everyone was very excited to apply and maybe got ahead of themselves in doing so, which was unfortunate because we encountered a lot of last minute issues, surprisingly, with coalitions. We had a case that there were 2 coalitions that wanted the same county on as members and weren't communicating with each other. And it came down to it during our conversations at the very end when we were issuing our state support letters. And again, when you shouldn't get to the very end and then start having those conversations. Those should be, again, very much nailed down, as early as possible so that when you do reach out to us, again, we're just, the final note. Please don't do it a week before you apply. Again, as soon as you kind of know that you want to apply for a grant, you can even start having those conversations with us at that time because we are, available to assist. And also we have our own listserv that I will again issue once we have the grant announcements. I will issue a heads up, hey, reminder, talk to us. let us know if you have any questions so that we can, again, communication is key through this whole process. Um, keep in touch and get you what you need, so that our part is not the stressful piece.
Hey Shelby, will you put a link to sign up for that listserv in the chat for us?
Yes, I can definitely do that. Thank you, Roxanne.
And thank you, Shelby. That's super helpful. I did not realize that happened last year in Ohio as far as those coalitions, and I hadn't heard of that happening before. So that is a good lesson to keep in mind for everybody out there. Talk to Shelby and talk to Ohio EPA
Yes.
early on.
Yes. Well,
Wonderful.
and Amy, like you said, again, regarding the cleanup, there is an added component that we include. So we just want to make sure that all the reports, as Hallie said, all the reports are done and that we have what
Yeah.
we need to review in order to get you what you need to apply.
Yeah.
So
And
thank you.
you're welcome. Thank you. Now we'll get into the meat of this panel presentation. Now that we've gone through a lot of just overall things to keep in mind and be aware of with respect to all of the brownfield applications. As I go through this, and I know as Roxanne will go through her parts today and tomorrow, just keep in mind this is in general. I base this on a community-wide assessment, but I do bring up where cleanup grants are a little bit different. Multi-purpose can be a tad bit different as well, but we aren't applying for it this year. But I just mentioned that because our group exercise focuses on a successful multi-purpose grant that was just awarded not that long ago to Youngstown Neighborhood Development Corporation. So again, this is in, overall what you should expect in any of these applications, RLF aside. As John said, that's kind of one of those things that you really want to get help on, and TAB can help on those, the differences there as well. So let's get started. Project area and plans for revitalization. Geographic boundaries is one of the things you're going to be asked to provide. Oftentimes, you don't have to, but oftentimes the geographic boundary, say you're a city, it might be the city's jurisdictional boundary. Or if you're a nonprofit, say a regional development corporation, that the jurisdictional boundaries that you work with. So you don't necessarily have to describe it in that way, but that's what we would suggest. It's a larger area that you have jurisdiction over, and your target area is going to be within that. Within that geographic boundary, you want to talk about your challenges and impacts. This is a really important part. This is the beginning of your grant. This is where you start saying, mentioning things like, we started out as a crossroads, a railway came through, we became a huge, railway stop for, off, either offloading or onloading certain materials or food stuff or things like that, that made that particular city or county or village really a place on the map, essentially. So historically, what did that? Often it typically is industrial, obviously, and though in other cases it could be a little bit different, but there is a downturn. And here in Region 5, we have a lot of industrial cities, and it's not unusual at all to have like a big steel manufacturer or, a big area of, oil refineries or gas manufacturing, which was, early on in Ohio. And then all of this changes. They move out, they move overseas, whatever the case may be. And then a lot of jobs are lost, a lot of areas go through a downturn, that sort of thing. And the basically this is what's going on and why everything is, not in where we would like it to see it and how it was in the quote unquote old days. Then you move on to your target area. So within that area, geographic area, like most, cities or towns or things like that, you're going to have an area or areas that were much worse hit than others. So higher unemployment, maybe this was where workers lived because way back when they could walk to the plant, things like that, or, just the people that lived in this particular area because it was ground industry and the housing prices were lower because it was loud and polluted, that sort of thing. So you're going to want to focus on a target area. This is usually a neighborhood corridor. It's a census tract. It can be a zip code, something of that nature. You're going to have a specific target area. And each of the grants that we're talking about today, the ones that will be available RLF excluded, can have more than one TA. You don't want to get too many, and I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow, but to make it just too confusing and hard to write the grant. As I mentioned down here, the coalition, you want to identify a target area and the coalition members, and both the lead and the other coalition, and have a target area for those. And this is just an example of language and that is maybe not as good and descriptive. It doesn't stand out as well versus something from a successful grant in the past that does. So I think Roxanne will do this. I will do this, kind of point out different things that work. And I forgot with the previous slide, Hallie, you had some comments. So sorry about that.
Oh, no, yeah, you're good.
Target areas. Yeah.
Yeah, so just in terms of considering the target areas, think long term, and a lot of these are maybe historical areas that have been commercial, industrial, but also in terms of are any of these sites already being targeted by maybe a developer or for some other funding or project? And sometimes there's overlap, and you have to take your chances and see what funding you get or which comes in first and that kind of thing, of course. But also just remember it is a longer time period than some other grants of when you're preparing the application to when you'll actually get the funds, and then also how long some of these grant periods are for the, like coalition assessment grants, it's several years. So are these going to be target areas, 5 years from now, or is it, a more limited thing or one large site that already has some interest in it that could still be assessed in, in an assessment grant? It can be the whole county or coalition areas. So if there is one site like that, it can still be incorporated into the grant, but in terms of, the inventory areas or corridor areas like that, you do want to think of ones that are going to be longer term in need of assessments. We've had to shift priorities in the past, which we can do and get approval for and everything like that, but it can just help when you're starting with that mindset of long-term areas to focus on.
And that is a great comment, and one I might add in the future, because that is very important to think about something that has long-term need, because a lot of what you're going to be doing, not only trying for this grant, but you're going to be identifying in this grant other sources of funding and other work that that probably will keep going after the money for this grant and the grant project has ended. So, and you may look for other brownfield grants, US or US EPA, but also grants through your state or through private and funds. And this is just a little bit of what you want to do in your target area. As I mentioned, you want to clearly define it. If you don't have if it's not a census tract, if it's not a zip code or a corridor, at least give street boundaries. You want to make sure that's really clear what that target area is. The reviewer needs to know that if you want to make it easy on them. and that it's just super clear what your target or target areas are. And the condition, you want to talk about different things like, do you have health issues? Do you have high unemployment, crime rate, that sort of thing. It, to the extent possible, quantify all those that the brownfields in this target area. And if you can give information about number of acres, what are they, mostly vacant lots? Are they aging buildings that are falling apart? Historic gas stations, that sort of thing. Just providing all that information to help the reviewer understand what your target area is, number one, and what their problems are and what it looks like, kind of in their mind. And you're going to be researching demographic, health and welfare, environmental, community need. So for your targets area. And again, well, this is actually the first time this brownfield grant data, and I'll talk about it in a minute in a little more detail, is really important for you. Target area. So here's just a example. Top, they provide some information about poverty rates and things like that, but it's not real detailed. There's no citations. Don't forget your citations. Those are the sorts of things, like John said, if they're missing, like missing answering a question, you're going to get points off. That it's just not good. You need to have all your details together. If you look at this other one, I'm not going to spend any time reading these, but it does give you a much more detailed picture. It provides some citations like the Census Bureau. It gives other information based on other research or other links, such as the Food Access Research Atlas or the Smart Location Mapping Tool regarding public access and food deserts and things like that. So, have varied data, cite it, and provide as many details as you can. You can put this in the table. You may see these in some of the sample applications, or not both sample applications that are on the TAB website, but also the ones John talked about. So if using a table helps, I think that makes that really easy on reviewers. About that data, there are some data links that were maintained in the past and recommended, but they're no longer being maintained by US EPA. So, people have been a little concerned about this. This is where I talk about the brownfield grant data. Some of my colleagues, really well-informed colleagues at KSU TAB, have put the grant data sheet together, and you just can click on that link on what's in our resources, what Hannah's put together, and get that, and it will provide you with all kinds of really, really good information. I'm going to show you a couple of things you can pull up here. This is your Distressed Communities Index. It will give you a score with respect to how distressed a particular community is. One thing I'll point out here, it's focusing on Worthington. And if you're familiar with Columbus, Ohio, Worthington's a wealthy suburb. That's probably the best way I can describe it. This other 43229 zip code over here is an older suburb, an older Columbus suburb that now has mostly, I would say, first generation immigrants living in it. And so obviously is not as wealthy by any means, because these are people new to the country, that sort of thing. So you can see that 14.2 Worthington's not real distressed, whereas 43229, or what I call the Northland area, is quite distressed. So this is a really helpful tool that you can use when writing your grant. EnviroAtlas, and I know in previous webinars with Ohio, we've done with Ohio EPA, we've had some demonstrations of this from US EPA personnel. But this just kind of gives you, there's a lot of different information that's provided on this, a lot of different layers. Once you go to this actual Enviro Atlas link and get on it. But this is just to give you a little bit of an example. Here's Cleveland. I just kind of focused on this dark little hexagon or whatever you want to call it, multigon. It's a block group, a census block group, and it talks about percentage of workers that are 60 to 90 minutes travel time to work. So they've got a huge travel time, even though they're in downtown inner city Cleveland. They may be going out to the suburbs to find better paying work. And, that can be a real problem. And if you're looking at, helping transportation access, that might be a good one. There's a lot of other, food access, different things like that that are on Enviro Atlas. So highly encourage you to look at that. And let's see. Now we are talking about actually getting into the description of priority brownfield sites. As I've mentioned before, we want to highlight one of the sites. You want to be detailed, include the past and current uses. If it's not being used or if it's underutilized, make sure that's really clear. Talk about the site conditions, what you know about the environmental issues. It'll be less, obviously, for if you're applying for an assessment grant versus a cleanup grant, where you will talk about the known contamination, utilizing the phase 2 for the site. And with coalition, you want to have at least one priority site in the lead entity's target area and one priority brownfield site in each non-lead entity's target area. So you want to make sure that you have at least one. I would recommend, even like with community-wide assessment, having more than one, but you don't want to have 10. Again, I'll talk about this tomorrow, like a downfall of having too many target areas or too many priority brownfields. Things get mixed up and it's harder to read and you get mixed up. And so you want to just focus on, a handful or a few really good priorities. And I think Kim Steigerwald has some other information and advice regarding this. So I'll pass it on to her.
We found from experience that identifying priority sites, you should have some sort of redevelopment already going on in the area. Who's investing, what's the redevelopment proposal, and why it's important to use the brownfield sites as it relates to the bigger development. And maybe this goes back to slides 12 and 13, where you're looking at your geographical area and then your smaller target area. And you should have done a lot of planning and assessment, not environmental assessment, but review work for these areas before you even contemplate doing the application. We found that when we have our successful applications have been when we've already done some groundwork. We've identified the site, we've done some acquisitions or site control, we've had some investment. We've also identified some of the major transportation corridors, proximity to employment centers. These are all going to be important when you pick your target area and then decide what your brownfield sites are going to be. Yes, you want to specifically talk about your brownfield sites in this section, but in the bigger area, you have strengths in these areas which you can build upon when you write your application.
Thanks, Kim. I think that's great advice. I'll just add on to that, and I may have stated this before, that another thing that's important is community involvement, talking with your community members in those target areas, making sure they're on board with it. That's something that is going to look really good on your application to your reviewers, but also it's going to help you in the long run. You don't want to be focusing on something that the community has no interest in, or maybe has no interest in how you're envisioning the redevelopment. Okay, here's a priority brownfield description example. This one has a really nice description of how it was used in the past. You know, foundry operations, what those operations were, what types of wastes there were, and what they expect as far as the contaminants, VOCs, PAHs, TPH, heavy metals. It is missing. No. I wonder if this is something you may have to click on, Hannah, because I have a couple pop-ups here. There we go. What's missing is why it's a priority. What's its redevelopment potential? Does it represent a significant health hazard to the community? Is it attractive nuisance? Do you have people that, teenagers or vandals or, homeless living in it or going in it and causing safety issues? Is it located in a floodplain, causing problems, or maybe an ecologically sensitive area, stream or wetlands nearby? Residential properties, are they near the site? Could these contaminants that they suspect are there be causing some of the health effects the community individuals are experiencing? So you want to make sure that you don't, you include all this information, not just some. Finally, we get to, in this section, your plan to identify additional sites. I've highlighted here on a successful application, the coalition will finalize Brownfields rubric. And this is if the coalition or your community-wide assessment has additional money. You're not going to see this in cleanup because you're asking just for money for that cleanup. But with community-wide other assessment grants, you may have extra money after you do your priorities that you've planned. And this outlines exactly, 1 through 6 different things that they feel are important that they'll score to help them pick additional sites if they have money left over. And to talk, I know both Hallie and Kim. Kim, I see you up right now, so I'll call on you first. Have some things to add to this that may be helpful in developing this type of rubric.
We found it very our successful applications included a partnership with Cuyahoga County's Site Readiness Fund. It is the biggest biggest nonprofit that's looking to revitalize vacant, abandoned industrial and manufacturing sites and assemble them. What I would encourage you is to find those type of leader organizations. They are going to be your biggest partners in trying to identify sites that you can use for your funds. You probably work with them already, but these big organizations, mentioning them in your application go a long way, whether you're using a coalition grant or not.
Thank you. Okay, we're starting to run out of time. So Hallie and Kill, if I skip over anything or I apologize. You may want to put something in the chat box because I don't want to take the time that's Roxanne's to go over section 2. Then the next part of this is revitalization of the target area and reuse strategy in alignment with revitalization plans. So basically, you're going to be talking about the reuse strategy or projected reuse and how it aligns with the land use plans or revitalization plans, city plans, whatever plans that are available. And even if a plan isn't available, if you're a small town, village, whatever, this may be things that have if that's the case and you don't have a specific plan, what we recommend or what I recommend is that you rely on do a lot. You need to do some upfront community if you haven't already, outreach, and find out what what they want to see, in these plans. So even if you don't have a plan, I've seen successful grants where you can rely on that. And with cleanup, it's a little different. You will talk about how the actual reuse is going to align with the local government land use, and how both public and partners were involved in developing that reuse. So it's important to have in the cleanup grants as well. I'm going to move on, and I will stop in a few, Kim and Hallie. So here is a strategy that from a successful grant where they talk about their master plan for their city, and how it aligns with their Falcon Street redevelopment area, and they list out what's in their master plan that it aligns with. So it's very clear. This is the kind of thing you want to talk about. And I liked at the end that they talked about public input. So if you do have public input, if you've done outreach and got buy-in, definitely mention that along with the revitalization plans that you align with. Okay, revitalization of the target area. So you want to focus on outcomes and benefits from this, and that will take place in the target area, and how it benefits the underserved populations. So if you have benefits, and you can detail them, we encourage you to do this. This is one thing I want to point out here. Updated infrastructure might be enhanced safety, sewer and stormwater upgrades are obviously going to help with issues with increased pollution in the future, walkability, health benefits, that sort of thing. Energy and cost benefits if you're using new construction that is mitigating noise, emissions to the air, that is saving energy, that sort of thing. Do talk about those benefits and be clear about them, and that will obviously be an extremely helpful part of your application. So strategy for leveraging resources. We want to know, as I mentioned before, hey, you need to be thinking about other, money. I think Kim talked about and Hallie talked about, thinking about target areas that will help in the future, where it will have continued needs and continue redevelopment. You want, one of the good things is for this grant, but also in the future, is think about leveraged funding. And in some cases with cleanup grant, you're going to have to demonstrate that you actually have secured funding. So make sure that you read those really carefully, and what you have, what you don't have, and what you need to have, so that you aren't turning in an application that needs secured funding in a certain area and does not have it. I'm going to just move on to the brownfield cleanup or strategy for leveraging resources. This is just from a successful grant. They list not only the grant that they're applying for, the cleanup grant, but they talk about the remediation program, the brownfield remediation program that Ohio Department of Development, I apologize, that was supposed to be development and not redevelopment, provides grants for that. The Ohio Brownfield Loan Program that our Ohio Water Development Authority Board provides, and Jobs Ohio, which also provides revitalization loans and grants. So, list them out. You can put them in a table. I've seen it done that way. You want to make it really clear. I believe Kim had some ideas on other funding that wasn't listed from this particular application.
We used funding from a couple other resources, including our County Department of Development had a pot of funds. We used federal ARPA funds that were provided to the municipality that we worked in, the city of East Cleveland. And we also are using NOACA's, our Northeastern Ohio Area-Wide Coordinating Agency is the recipient of a US EPA revolving loan fund. And so we've tapped into the NOACA's revolving loan fund for brownfields to help some of our projects be funded as well. So there's all sorts of other options to layer funding for projects.
That's great. And I'm glad you mentioned that. And we're talking about a cleanup grant. So if this is something like an assessment grant, coalition assessment, you may want to talk about Ohio EPA's targeted brownfield assessment program and some of their technical assistance and things like that that would definitely help with assessment level type of funding or basically technical assistance. Okay, strategy for leveraging resources. This is where I talked about make sure there are 3 categories. This is different than the assessment grants where they want to make sure that you do have, and the state letter, as Shelby was talking about, does talk that the state thinks that you have done adequate assessment. But in case there's something that comes up, they want to make sure that you've kind of thought about resources if you would actually need to have additional site characterization, additional kind of phase 2 or phase 2 assessment work done. What is needed for site remediation? Generally, you have to say what I asked for in this grant is going to provide me what I need, and for the cleanup, or if it's not, what's your other source? And that source has to be secured, and you need to show a letter of commitment and attach that to your grant. Resources needed for site reuse. They're going to be looked at much more favorably if you have secured resources, and do attach that attach that documentation if it is secured, but consider all reuse activities like demolition and construction. You can add non-secured ones as well, just so we know what you're aware of and the reviewers do, and that you're thinking through for this type of activity. And I'm just going to see if Kim or Hallie have anything else they want to mention quickly before we move on to Roxanne's section 2, community need and community engagement. Okay, sorry, I had to go through the last part quickly. And Roxanne, I'm going to pass this on to you.
Thank you, Amy. All right, so I have a total of 6 minutes to go through this to keep us on track, but I'm going to go through it a little quickly. So if you can hang on with me, we will get a break soon. We're going to go a little over time, but we'll make up at the time after break in the breakouts. So just hang with me. So we're moving on to community need and community engagement. I always think of this section as the part of the application where you really start telling the story of your community. So we've talked about the project and the target area, but EPA wants to understand, like, why does this community need the funding? Who is being impacted? And how are the people who live and work here actually involved? One thing I want you to keep in mind throughout this entire section is that data alone can't tell your story. You can give a reviewer every poverty rate, health statistic, demographic number you can find, but you still need to tell them what those numbers mean for your community and how this grant connects those conditions to your community. So we're going to walk through both community need and community engagement and look at the places where applicants commonly leave points on the table for missed items. All right. So the first question is pretty straightforward. Why do you need the money? EPA is not asking you to simply say, oh, we don't have enough money, because every applicant could say that. You need to explain why your community has limited resources. So maybe you have a small population, maybe you have a low income population or limited tax base. Um, Maybe you've experienced population loss or declining property values. So take it one step further from that and tell the reviewer where your existing resources are already going. So if your community has $10 million budget, a reviewer may look at that and think, why can't they pay for phase one or phase two? Your job is to explain that 9.8 million of that budget is already committed to essential services, infrastructure, water and sewer improvements, public safety, whatever is true for your community. So looking at the example here, it doesn't just say the city has limited funding. It gives the population housing values, housing burden, and then explains that the city experienced a cyber attack that cost them $2 million dollars and set them back. So describe and quantify. Pay attention to the scoring note at the bottom. If your inability to access other funding is not related to having a small population or being low income, you may only earn up to 2 of the 5 points that you need. And in a highly competitive application process, that's a lot of points. So this is one of those areas where you really need to be very intentional about answering exactly what the EPA is asking. I do have comments from our panel members, but due to time, I'm going to ask that the panel members please put your comments in the chat for people to kind of review as we go through this, so that we don't get further behind. So as we move into sensitive populations, EPA strongly encourages you to use data to characterize your target area. But there's an important FY26 change here that happened last year, that will most likely also be coming up in FY27. EPA does not require or recommend a very specific mapping tool like they did before. So in previous years, there was a lot of focus on particular federal tools, but for FY26, the emphasis is really on using very credible, reliable data sources that best document the conditions in your community. I've included a few examples here, such as EnviroAtlas that Amy mentioned, TRI and CDC places, but these are just examples. They're not required tools. You can also use census or ACS data, county health rankings, state health department data, local health assessments, or other very reputable sources. The important thing is to choose your data that actually helps you tell your story. Don't just use a statistic because you found it. Ask yourself, what does this data demonstrate? How does it support the argument I'm making in this section? The reviewer themselves should not have to figure out why it matters, because if they do, it's going to kind of go right over and not necessarily count towards that story. We also have some more data in our resources of more links to be able to utilize as well that was put together by Beth Grigsby. All right. So what do we mean by sensitive populations? These are populations that are likely to experience elevated health risks from pollution. Your response needs to do essentially 3 things. First, clearly identify who the sensitive populations are in your target area. Second, describe the health or welfare issues those populations are experiencing and the severity of those issues. And third, and this is the piece we see missed all the time, explain how the grant and the proposed reuse will address those issues or help identify and reduce the related threats. You cannot just stop after the data. For example, the language here says the grant will help reduce environmental contamination that may be associated with chronic disease rates and help lessen the target area's health burdens. That is the connection. Think about this section as who is vulnerable, what are they experiencing, and how does this project help that? You need to make the connection very obvious for the reviewers. All right, so getting more specific about who may qualify as a sensitive population, that could include infants, children, elderly residents, pregnant women, low-income populations, or people experiencing serious disease burdens. But again, simply telling me that 24% of your target area is elderly is not enough. What does that mean? Are your elderly residents living adjacent to former industrial properties? Are children attending a school near your priority site? Does your target area have elevated rates of chronic respiratory disease? Then tell me how severe the condition is. And finally, you want to connect it to the Brownfield project specifically and the proposed reuse of that project. So one of the sequences that I like to use or like to see is who is vulnerable, then what health or welfare issue exists, How severe is it? And how will the brownfield project and reuse strategy address or reduce the related threat? If you answer those four questions, you're much more likely to give the reviewer what they need to be able to connect all of those things together and give you the full amount of points. So this is where a table can actually be incredibly helpful. Tables are not required in your narrative. EPA is not telling you that you have to format your response this way, but remember the person reviewing your application may be reading multiple applications and looking for very specific information. So if I bury 6 statistics in a paragraph, I'm asking the reviewer to find and compare all of those numbers themselves. But if I put the same data into a table like this, the disparity is immediately visible. So if you look at the target area compared to the city, state, and national data, you can notice that I've only bolded the target area values that demonstrate a disparity. So we're helping draw the reviewer's eye to the story. The table represents and presents the evidence. Your narrative still needs to explain what that evidence means. So you can't assume the reviewer will look at the bold numbers and make the connection for you. You have to use the table to make the data easy to access, but then you use your narrative to tell the story. So this criterion is specifically looking for a greater than normal incidence of disease or adverse health conditions. There are two important things I would like for you to notice here. First, the data should be specific to your target area and to the extent that reliable data is available. So if it's not available, don't worry about it. Second, you need a baseline. So if I tell you the asthma rate in my target area is 8.8%, you have no idea if that is high or low if you're a reviewer. So if I tell you it's 8.8% compared to 7.5% statewide and 5.1% nationally, now you can see that disparity. So what EPA means when it talks about greater than normal is you need to establish what is considered average or expected and then demonstrate that your target area exceeds that baseline. Also, this is a very important scoring point because you want to make sure that you address at least one of the specific conditions EPA identifies: cancer, asthma, or birth defects. You can absolutely include other conditions, diabetes, kidney disease, coronary heart disease, whatever is relevant to your community. But if you don't include at least one of those specifically identified conditions, you may only earn 2 of the 5 points. So again, don't make the reviewer work to find the disparity. You have to show it. So this is an important criterion that was in FY26, and I want to spend a little time on it just because it's an area where applicants can easily fall into the trap of just providing more poverty statistics. EPA is asking you to describe populations that are economically impoverished and or disproportionately impacted by negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, or commercial operations or policies. So yes, economic data can be important. Poverty rates, unemployment, housing burden, population or job loss, all of those may demonstrate economic conditions, but look at the other side of the criterion. Where are the brownfields located? Where has industrial activity historically occurred? Are there concentrations of vacant or contaminated properties, dumping, transportation infrastructure, other environmental burdens? And there's a population is there a population in your area that has disproportionately experienced those consequences? The key here, again, which is a theme, is connection. Who, why, impact, response. Those are the four things that I think you guys should focus on and keep in order. So, who is impacted? Why are they economically impoverished or disproportionately impacted? What environmental consequences have they experienced? And how will this grant and the proposed reuse respond to that consequence? Look at the example language on the slide. It connects low-income residents of decades of concentrated industrial activity and vacant contaminated properties, and then directly explains how the grant will identify risks and advance reuse. So don't just give EPA another page of statistics. Tell them what happened in this community, who has been carrying that burden, and how this project moves things forward for them. So moving into community need and engagement, the first thing I want to say is you probably have more partners than you think you do. I think we've heard a little bit about that already. When people start writing this section, they sometimes only think about the environmental consultant or the state brownfields program. So look at this list. Your health department may have data or public health expertise. Workforce development partners may connect development to employment opportunities. Economic development organizations may understand market conditions. Neighborhood organizations know the people who actually live near those sites. You have universities, community colleges, chambers, visitor bureaus. All of these organizations have a relevant role. TAB can also be a partner. We can help with outreach, technical assistance, visioning, data, facilitation, and other project needs as you go through this process. Last year in FY26, EPA evaluated whether you involve a variety of local organizations, entities, and groups that are relevant to the project. And the key word here is relevant to the project. So don't call partners like Pokemon just to make your application look impressive. Just think about your actual project and ask who needs to be at the table to make this successful. And if you need help with that, again, reach out to TAB or the state or any of your local partners. Sorry. Okay, project roles. So once you've told EPA who's involved, now you need to explain what they're actually going to do. So this is where we often see applications become too generic. The neighborhood association supports this project. Okay, what does that mean? Are they conducting outreach? Are they helping identify priority sites? Are they reviewing reuse plans, housing meetings, sharing information with residents? Look at the example on the table that I put here because we identify the partner, provide a point of contact, and then describe their specific role. This makes the involvement very tangible for the reviewer. And remember, project involvement and project roles are related, but they're not the same criterion. So one asks who is involved, the other asks what will they do. For assessment coalitions, you also need to specifically discuss how each non-lead coalition member will be engaged and informed throughout the project. And one more reminder, involve partners that are relevant to your project and involve different types of partners. So a list of 10 government agencies may not demonstrate the same variety as a thoughtful group of government, community, health and economic development, and resident serving organizations. All right, so now we're getting into incorporating community input, and I want you to notice how much EPA is actually asking for here. How will you communicate project progress? How will you communicate with the local community, especially residents who are directly affected by the work? How will you communicate with your partner organizations? How often will communication occur? And what methods will you use? What to in-person engagement are you providing? And finally, how will you meaningfully solicit, consider, and respond to community input? That last part is incredibly important. The public meeting is not automatically meaningful community engagement. Sending a newsletter is not automatically getting community input. Posting something on Facebook is not a feedback process. EPA wants to understand how information is going out and how input is coming back, and then what you're actually going to do with that input. So looking at this example, at first glance, it could sound really good. They have a board, they have a regional brownfield partnership, they have 24 municipalities involved. They're going to host kickoff meetings and progress meetings to solicit public input. That's all great. But as a reviewer, I would still have questions. So who actually considers that input that's being given? Is it the staff, the board, the regional brownfield partnership, the project team? What, who documents that input? How frequently is that engagement going to occur? What happens if someone can't attend a meeting? And maybe most importantly, how does the applicant respond to the community? If residents tell you they want a park and the final reuse plan is a commercial development, then what happens? I'm not saying you have to do everything your community asks. Obviously, you probably can't, and that is a challenge of community engagement. But you should have a process for saying, here's what we heard, here's what we considered, here's what we changed, and here's why some suggestions couldn't be incorporated. So think about the process at the bottom. You solicit, document, consider, respond, and then incorporate where appropriate. Don't leave the feedback sitting in a meeting notebook somewhere. It's important to figure out how that's going to be applied. So now compare the previous example to this one. This response gives us frequency, quarterly project updates, and at least 2 public meetings annually. It identifies targeted outreach to residents and businesses and priority sites. It provides alternatives to in-person participation, which is online, by phone, and through printed materials and paper surveys. Then it tells who is responsible for documenting and tracking comments, the project manager. It explains when the project team will consider input before key decisions involving site prioritization, assessment, cleanup, planning, and reuse. And then, most importantly, they close the loop. The city reports back to the community and explains what is heard, how input influenced decisions, and when a suggestion can't be incorporated and why. That's a feedback loop. So you inform, solicit, document, consider, respond, incorporate, and report back. So the difference between this and the previous example is that they held more meetings and they described the process for their meaningful engagement. So I put this slide together and I'll briefly go over it. It's just that the 3 criteria can start to sound very similar when you're trying to put together the application. And when we see applicants copy and paste essentially the same responses 3 times or in different areas, um, I can understand why that is challenging to figure out what to put where. So here's the easiest way I know how to separate them. First is project involvement is the who is at the table, what organizations. Project roles is the what those partners are actually doing and how they're meaningful. And then incorporating community input is the how will the community receive information, provide input, and influence what happens next. So if I have a neighborhood organization, I might identify them under project involvement. Under project roles, I explain they're helping conduct outreach and identify priority sites. And then under incorporating community input, I explain how resident feedback collected through that outreach will be documented, reviewed, responded to, and considered in site prioritization. Same partner, different questions. Beth uses a table like this a lot when she's helping communities build out brownfield projects, and hers is much more involved, and she's an excellent resource with Tab if you need help with this process. So if you can answer these questions separately, you'll have a much stronger response and more likely to get all of the points that you need. All right, we're almost done. I want to close this section with one really simple idea. Community engagement is a two-way street, which we've already pretty much outlined. You need to inform people. You need to tell residents what's happening at a site, what assessments are occurring, what the timeline is, and what decisions are being made. But you also need to create opportunities for community input and then actually use that input. Community input can be really useful to help shape development goals. It can identify issues you didn't know existed. It can create new partnerships, new synergies. And when people see ideas reflected in a project, they develop a sense of ownership in the outcome and makes projects become way more successful. Engagement also cannot be a one-time public meeting held because you needed to check a box for the grant application. It should continue throughout the entire grant period and potentially even afterwards once the project is up and rolling or redevelopment begins. So think about meaningful engagement as a continuous feedback loop, once again, as I mentioned. So if there's one thing you take away from the community engagement section, it's this, is that the EPA isn't just asking how you're going to talk to the community. They want to know how the community will be a part of the project. All right, we're going to get started. And this time we're moving into the hands-on portion of the workshop. So we spent a lot of time this morning talking about what makes a grant, a strong grant application, and what reviewers are looking for, and some of the lessons that our panelists have learned throughout the years with their own experiences. So now you're going to get to put some of that into practice. So the goal of this exercise is to really give you an opportunity to look at an actual successful grant application through the lens of a reviewer and some of the nuances that you do or do not catch while doing that. So we're not expecting you to become an EPA grant reviewer in the next hour. There's no prize for being like the hardest scorer in the room. What we really just want you to do is slow down, look carefully at the criteria, and think about whether the applicant is giving you what you need to evaluate their proposal. There we go. So each of you are going to be assigned to a working group in just a few minutes. Zoom will move you into a breakout room with a facilitator. We're going to have 6 facilitators. 3 of them will be doing section 1 to review, so you're not reviewing like a large portion of the grant. Um, and 3 of them will be doing section 2. Tomorrow, however, we're all going to just do section 3. You have about an hour to work through the exercise, actually probably closer to 50 minutes now. And your facilitator is there to help guide the conversation and keep an eye on the time, but this is really intended to be a group discussion. So the idea is to hear different perspectives. Um, the suggestion is that you spend approximately the first 10 minutes reviewing your assigned section individually, make notes, highlight things, write down questions or places where you think something is especially strong or where you feel like information might be missing. And then you guys come back together as a group, discuss what you found, and work toward a group score. You can also need to select someone, preferably not your facilitator, from your group to report out when we come back together. And we'll spend a short period of time talking about how you guys scored and if where you guys vary as groups in the scoring. So one thing I really want you to pay attention to as you review the application is the applicant's overall story. Does the narrative connect? Do the pieces support one another? By the end of the section, you should understand the community, the challenges, and why funding matters. So sometimes an applicant may technically answer every question, but still fail to connect all those answers into a strong narrative. So this is one of the things we want you to kind of be thinking about today as you go through this. So you have 3 primary tools for today's exercise, the most important being the narrative review information. These should have, and the grant itself, these would have been sent out to you last night, but they're also available in the resources link that are in the chat. So you can pull them up now if you don't have them in front of you or don't have a physical copy of that you wanted to print out. Your second resource is the grant guidelines. When you use you want to use this when you go back to the actual guideline language to confirm what the EPA is actually asking the applicant to address under particular criterion or sub-criterion. And then you have your grant, as I mentioned. So my recommendation is to keep the narrative review information open, keep the grant application open, and then maybe refer back to the full guidelines when you need clarification. So let me go on to the next slide. That might be helpful. All right. So as you work through the application, a few things. Is the narrative clear? Is it concise? Did the application actually answer every criterion? Ask yourself whether they provided enough detail for you to evaluate the merits of the proposal. You may understand what the applicant's trying to say, but did they actually provide the information needed to support what they're saying? Where is the support at and how is it shown? You also want to pay attention to the data. Are they providing actual percentages, percentiles, credible data resources, or just broad statements? You also want to make sure that they respond to all parts of the question. So one of the easiest mistakes applicants make is giving a fantastic answer to half of a criterion and then completely missing the other half of it. So you should also pay attention to the sample tables they included in the guidelines and kind of look at the tables that they provided. If the applicant does not use their format that the EPA provides, that doesn't mean anything. You need to make sure the required information is still included. So if I knew nothing about this, what I want you to ask yourself is if I knew nothing about this community before opening this application, did the application give me enough information to understand the need and confidently evaluate the proposal? So that's the lens that you should kind of be using for this exercise. So we also have a form that the facilitators will have to kind of guide you through the scoring aspect. So with that, I'm gonna have us break out into our breakout groups. And if you guys have any questions or technical issues as you go through the process, you can still utilize the chat and reach out. And I will see you in about 15 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We have a few minutes left to be able to do a report out. And so this is just kind of to see how all the other groups kind of scored the application. We're going to do section 1 and section 2. I think we kind of split up almost evenly in the sections. And so if a section goes and you have something to add, if you could just add what might be different or separate than what the group prior added, that way we're not trying to replicate things and it can go just a little bit quicker since we're a little short on time. Do we have any volunteers from section 1?
Yes, we do.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, we had a great team, Crystal, Bill, and Michelle. all participated, and Michelle will be doing, she's the spokesperson. Is she able to turn on her camera?
Yes, all participants, you can unmute and turn your cameras on if you're the report out person.
Excellent. All right. Okay,
So,
Michelle.
so in the first section, we scored it 34 out of 45. The first part, we had 11 out of 15. Um, Statistics were given of the city, but not of the actual area that they were looking at. There didn't seem to be a description of the priority of the brownfield sites. We felt the information was kind of jumbled, kind of scattered all over. And they didn't seem to have an identifying options, um, identifying the additional sites. On the revitalization section of it, we had a 13 out of 20. Very vague. Again, providing city statistics, talked about an income tax. We assume that would be for the income tax that they have would be for the entire city, not again for this service area. The comments were general. But on the strategy side of things, we had them at a 10 out of 10, thought they did good on additional funding on the project and good description of existing site information.
Our team here, they were pretty tough on the application scoring. I think that's it for us,
Oh,
Roxanne.
good. Yeah, you guys were. That's good. That means they were detail focused. All right. Do we have another group for panel one?
Yeah, we do. And actually, it was Kelly McCarthy, Adam, and I think Hallie was on for a bit, but she couldn't stay on. So it was just the three of us, and mostly Kelly and I. So Kelly's going to I'm going to share my screen, and Kelly's going to discuss our scoring.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, we were not as harsh as the previous group in our scoring. I'll say that much. And I think part of that is, of course, with the clue that they were ultimately selected for funding. So we know that, the scorers ultimately viewed their proposal favorably in one way or another. The few areas where we did dock some points in section 1C in terms of identifying additional sites. They were a little bit vague. I think they were sort of leaning on the fact that they had a previous assessment grant from 2018 and, again, sort of assuming that the reader would have any idea what that proposal entailed, where, obviously that's not the case. And so being a little more specific in terms of what criteria they might use to select additional sites if the funding, allowed them to do that, I think would have been helpful. And then in terms of outcomes and benefits of the reuse strategy, we docked a couple points there as well, only because we weren't totally clear. They talked about reuse of one of the sites for workforce housing, but there wasn't a lot of specificity in terms of what employers might be benefiting from that. What sort of economic growth had they been seeing in the area that resulted in this need for additional workforce housing? How many units of workforce housing? Those types of questions we were left wondering about. And then the only other place that we docked a point was in the resources needed for site reuse. They were sort of aspirational and talking about, an additional $25 million of investment from all these potential sources, which is certainly believable, but maybe again lacking a little bit of specificity. And then Amy also pointed out that they were talking about in-kind staff resources, which doesn't belong in that section necessarily. So, but overall, we thought it was a strong proposal. So,
Thanks, Kelly.
mhm.
Appreciate it.
Nice. Thanks for adding that. All right. I believe we have one more group for the first section.
Yes, our group will report out. Sarah Tebby will be reporting. We also had the honor of having Sarah from YNDC on our group, and she was part of the application. So we had some interesting discussion with her as well. So, but I didn't
That's
make the
awesome.
other Sarah report. We'll have Sarah Tebby report out on our group.
Okay, so we gave it a 47 out of 50. We took a point out of section 1B because we thought the locations weren't completely defined, like there were 2 addresses, but it stated 7 phase ones. So maybe adding the additional addresses would have given that the extra point there. And then 1D, the overall plan, we kind of thought if there was just a little more verbiage connecting to the plan, that it would have tied it up, just be a little more descriptive there. But overall, yeah, we were pretty happy with the looks of this application. It seemed to have a lot of descriptives and the benefits associated with it. So
Thank you. All right. Some of you guys were really strict. I mean, we know that it got really good scores, obviously, because it got the grant application. But I think it's really interesting to see, when somebody who's a little bit more maybe familiar with these grants go in and dissect them, how much we notice when we're comparing it. Okay, so section 2. Do we have a volunteer for
Yeah. My section had Vince and Amanda. We had some really good conversations. And if possible, whoever's leading the screen, could you share the points criteria so she can follow along just in case? And Amanda will kick it off.
Yeah, so we were reviewing, hopefully you guys can still see me. We were reviewing the community need and engagement section. And in general, we had some like discrepancies in like individual scores, but we were somewhere between like a 38 or so. We thought it was a pretty well written application. What we noted in some sections is that they're providing, like in the community need, they're providing clear numbers for why this corridor or like these group of neighborhoods is really needed, but not necessarily relating that directly back to like why the larger city doesn't have funding, which we were sort of went back and forth on like, is that a good way to do it, or are you leaving like information on the table that a reviewer might poke at? They, for the most part, in all the sections, do a good job of citing the data and clearly showing that like this is higher than that. They specifically talk about the asthma. They specifically talk about seniors. One of the things that we did note that could have been better is that specifically when you look at the health or the disease and adverse health conditions, they're comparing nation, the county, and then the city at large. That potentially, depending on what data you're able to get, you could have pulled out specific census tracts. And that might have been more like it might have showed larger disparity than just what they were able to display for those. And then one of the things that we had, we thought their use of a table was good, but we noted that they could have saved space by like changing the columns size a little bit for table 2 for project partners. And then one question that we had this section was a little bit awkward because they talk about project involvement and project roles, but they broke it out like the scoring criteria breaks out into 2 separate sections, but they really do dovetail into each other really well. And so they combined them, calling section F project involvement and project roles, which meant that they actually didn't have an H. And so we were curious because they certainly answer all the questions, but they don't, like technically G is input where like H should be input. And we weren't sure, like we sort of figured there's no way that they lost 5 points and then still got awarded for just like not having a section H. But we wondered like how careful should applicants be in combining sections like that?
I think that's a really great question. We also noticed that. Obviously, they still got all the points, so how careful they need to be is just dependent on who reviews. I think that it all they would have needed to do would be to label it better. So if they would have just put, sections F and G and made it very clear. So if they would have put 2.F project involvement and 2.G project roles as a header and then had 2H, then it would have been completely fine the way that they structured it. But the labeling, yeah, threw us off as well.
Yeah, our score landed about being that we're between a 4 and a 5 on some of them. It landed between almost perfect to then 38.
Awesome. Thank you. Shelby, do you want to go?
Yes, I will share my screen for our team. We had Heather, Ursula, and Robert. Um, and Ur- uh, and Heather will do our report out. I will share my screen. We weren't able um, to get through everything. I want to make sure I do the right one. Um, so ours varies, but yes, Heather, if you want to do a report out.
Yeah, of course. So our group all kind of agreed that it met a lot of the marks. It was very well written and explained the situation that that area in Youngstown was trying to get the grant for. So they did get awarded for it. We agree that the statistics told a story. And just described what the current environmental status is. We felt it was very, well-written story. You could kind of like place yourself in Youngstown. We also agreed that like the table that they had, definitely the two tables they had helped with kind of clarity, especially with like when they were listing the different associations and everything with contact information. And you can tell that they really put in a lot of community involvement. In section B, we did notice that the last couple of sentences didn't necessarily explain how what their plans were to do with the buildings would directly affect like the health and welfare. So we kind of thought section B could have been written a little bit differently. But overall, we just thought it was very tied together. Everything was tied together and very coherent. The data spoke for itself.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank
Heather.
you.
Thank you.
And then I will share my screen for our group. All right, and I believe Corin is going to speak for us.
Yeah, so similarly with the other two groups for this section, we did think it was very good. We scored it at a 38 out of 40. There's just a few points I want to mention before we wrap up, I guess. Okay, so like for the first section, the criteria, I guess, was either mentioned that it's a small population or that it's disadvantaged financially. And I think one of those was met, but not the small community. So the community numbers, I think, was mentioned earlier, but not specifically in that section. So that was something we took a point off for. It also, in that section, didn't mention if there were other funds that were utilized, and it didn't really mention how, or it wasn't very clear how the grant would, how that would help, how the funding would help. So I think we took a point off in the very initial section. I think that those things were captured other places. They just weren't captured in that particular section. Something else I wanted to mention, we did score it at a 5, but the next section there, the health or welfare of sensitive populations, it was I think the poverty level or the children was explained, but not the older individuals. So I think that it just said older individuals, but didn't explain what that meant. Like, was that 65 and above? And also it didn't have a reference value. So it said 20% was older, but it was like, is that the average or above average or lower. So I think that could have been more clarified. But I think overall, we did give that point 5 sections, or we did give that section 5 points. The other thing I wanted to mention was at the end, the project involvement and that table and the project roles. We thought the table was really good. The roles were very clearly defined. We did have another issue. That was where we took the other point off, was explaining how those community organizations related to the neighborhood specifically. It was kind of explained, but it wasn't very clear specifically why those entities were selected, how they related, were there like members of those community groups that were part of the neighborhood, that kind of thing. So maybe just more like explanation of the relevance of them. So it sounded like they were near, they were close by, they were maybe relevant in the sense that like there was one neighborhood association, but it wasn't in that particular neighborhood. So maybe just bridging the gap of this was a similar neighborhood that went through similar situations, so they have insight on how to help our neighborhood. So just more clarity on that. So we just took the 2 points off for, it was mostly just clarity. I think all the information was there, but it was just making sure that that was more clarified. But overall, obviously, it was very good.
Thank you, Corin. All right, let me see if I can get I don't have my slide ability to move the slides, Hannah, but if you could, oh, thanks.
Yep.
Awesome. So I hope that was super helpful for you guys. We're going to be doing section 3 tomorrow and going over section 3 and 4 tomorrow. So it should also be a really great conversation. To connect with Tab and get our emails and of other workshops and things are going on, you can scan this QR code. These are a few of the contacts of some of the speakers today, if you want to write that information down. But again, that will also be in the presentation, which is going to be available, as will the recording. And then also, again, if you are not coming back tomorrow, if you could please go ahead and fill out a survey. If you are coming back tomorrow, you can just wait until tomorrow. That's fine. We just want to make sure that you have it for when you need it. And then just a brief overview of what tomorrow is going to look like. We are going to go through a few introductions. We're going to go a little bit more in depth into the Ohio Brownfields program with their TBA, and then some other resources. Beth is going to go over some helpful hints, data links, and resources, which is always a very difficult area. So that is going to be an excellent presentation. And then we'll have our panel presentation again with Amy and I, and we'll be going over sections 3 and 4. We'll be doing writing a strong proposal, so kind of like wrapping everything together that we've talked about over the last 2 days into one little short presentation, and then we'll do the group exercise. So we hope to see you again tomorrow, and we hope you can stay for the group exercise part again. And we do have a little bit of time if there are questions in the chat that haven't been answered. Let me see. Or if there's anything that you guys want to ask now. Otherwise, you guys can hop off and we will see you tomorrow.